unnerve you a little. Require legal disclaimer.
Trey.
Anyway, Trey is going to talk about parables of prayer. And so I'll turn it over to you if you want to open in prayer.
Thank you. Will you open us in prayer? Lord God, we thank you for giving us this gift of prayer so that we may know you, discern your will, and realign our lives to your light for what you ask of us, what you want for us. And we pray that in our prayers that we remain steadfast and focused on you, that we may remain persistent in the hope that we'll bring all things to yourself, and that our lives will be a reflection of your will and bring you honor and glory. Christ. So all spiritual disciplines, spiritual acts, prayer seems to be the most essential. I would go so far as to argue that nobody can hope to have a fruitful spiritual life with the attitude of, prayer's not that necessary. I can take the sacraments, I can go to church, but prayer is something I can just kind of push aside and just do it whenever it's corporal prayer. As such an attitude, it's not going to yield a productive or even sustaining spiritual life, because prayer is the one thing we have to communicate with God, both speak to him and hear him. Of course, we speak in an immediate way to God, and oftentimes hearing God comes much after our prayer. We may have a faint notion of what God is saying, or we may have no notion at all. But in our prayers, it doesn't just end with quiet times. In a way, we live in prayer, and that we're constantly communicating with or discerning God's will. And when we're not, we are reminded that perhaps it is time to return to our prayerful life. So, with that in mind, I want to lead off with the question, how can prayer nourish our spiritual life?
So one of the most practical effects is building mental habits of what things you're thinking about and what things come to your awareness when you're going throughout your day and encountering whatever you are.
Exactly. So that daily discipline, perhaps multiple times a day, that discipline, it attunes your mind to the most pressing issues, either ones for yourselves or with us, because we do have such an open and prayer list and just prayer attitude for the needs, worries, those in the congregation as well. So it allows you, I guess, to maintain a community whenever the bodies themselves are dispersed throughout the week. How else can it nourish our spiritual life?
I think it teaches us trust. If we're going into prayer, we're asking someone else for help, and it humbles us and reminds us of who's really greater and help us. And God listens for us, and he answers those prayers in serious prayers.
Exactly. So we have to sort of relinquish our desire for self-control. We are admitting in prayer that we cannot solve this on our own. And in that admission, we are hoping and trusting that God will lead, intercede for us, or do what we are capable of doing on our own. But also working with us as well, establishing a relationship. I don't know if anybody, whenever they pray, they think that their vessel's going to open up and God is going to work in them as some sort of autonomic responses. So it's a connection we establish. Trust that connection. Any other ways prayer can nourish our spiritual life?
For me, using the daily office, the morning and evening prayer offices force me to pray for things that I might not otherwise pray for. And so one of the things that prayer, at least the discipline of prayer through the morning and daily office, promise is that it opens my attention and care and concern for a much broader array of things than whatever happens to be bothering me right now or whatever's on my mind right now. And so it really helps foster compassion, it helps foster empathy for other situations. So it broadens my view, I guess, by using the prayer book.
Yes, and what's interesting in morning and evening prayers, most of the prayers are exactly that, directed towards fostering attitudes that benefit others, that benefit the world. And then the time for intercession comes at the end, before the general thanksgiving. So you spent a good 10 to 15 minutes praying for attitudes that you can present to the world that will help them, and also praying for others, and largely just for God's Spirit and will to be done in the world, and for the others to recognize it. And then it comes time, of course, for intercession, where you can pray for yourself, but then also you're just in this attitude of praying for a broader cause. So, typically, just personal experience usually goes intercessions for others, and then sort of work your way down to for yourself and general thanksgiving. That's not the hard and fast rule, it's just well, very good. On the flip side, then, what attitudes, how can prayer perhaps cripple our spiritual life?
It's possible to be imbalanced in anything, and there have been concerns throughout the history of the church that some people pray to the exclusion of actually helping other people or doing other things that prayer might lead them to do.
So it's like, I pray this to God, it's in His hands, and I can wash my hands of all responsibility or obligation. Okay. What else?
I would not so much say that the tool of prayer it would be bad, more as the tool could be misused. Like the tool was simply used as a means of either glorifying yourself in front of other people, or like to merely like kind of have this like genie in a bottle concept of what God is. Then the tool of prayer can be used, but I don't know how to say prayer as that.
Yeah.
So the means,
Cosmic vending machine.
yeah, the means by which prayer is used can cripple your spiritual life. So praying for strictly material things, just for the clouds of having material riches, can surely be a cripple. Okay, great. Okay, any other means by which? So we have a means of washing your hands of any obligations to do the Lord's will. Now that you have prayed it shall be done, and then walk away. We also have the means of praying for material possessions to give you status, worldly status. Okay, any last ones? Perhaps hurt or hinder your spiritual growth.
Well, Jesus talks about warning against vain repetitions and prayers of many words, presumably one who is just sort of repeating almost mindlessly mantras or sayings or phrases, in wrongly thinking that that's prayer. And so if your approach to prayer is, well, I just need to say these words, and it's like magic, that would be a hindrance to spiritual life. But again, not because prayer is wrong, but it's wrongly.
So those two things are kind of what I want us to keep in mind as we look at three parables. And in each one, we have sort of a dichotomy. And I would like for us to wonder, how can these attitudes towards prayer nourish your spiritual life? And then how are these, characters in these parables perhaps hindering your spiritual life? The way that to their actions and behavior. So the first one I want to look at is called the friend at midnight. It's in Luke chapter 11, verses 5 to 13. So chapter 11, verse 5 through 13. Yeah. If I could have a volunteer who wants to read it. Go for it.
Jesus said to them, suppose one of you has a friend. You go to him at midnight. You say, friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread, for a friend of mine has arrived, and I have nothing to set before him. And he answers from within, don't bother me. The door has already been locked. My children are with me in bed. I can't give up and give you anything. I tell you, even though he will not get up and give him anything because he's his friend, at least because of his persistence, he will get up and give him whatever he needs.
So what behaviors or responses in this parable stand out as either profound or just confusing?
Well, there's that sense of, okay, so like God's going to play games and say, oh, no, I've got to, check boxes. You have to get all your punches before I'm going to give you what you pray for.
Okay, so she's setting up a set of criteria that you have to hit here. The man has missed all criteria because the door is shut, children are in bed, which means the man cannot give up. So because you are, I guess, too late to go to the party, you cannot have its fruits. Okay. What other behaviors or responses stand out as bewildering? Off.
We get the impression that the thing that unlocks the answer is badgering and not relationship, which is surprising. Well, he's a friend. It's his friendship that will prompt him to action. It's not his friendship, it's the fact that he's very persistent. Keeps backing out of it. Let's see, perhaps perplexing.
Exactly. So in Jesus' time, then, when hospitality is next to sacredness, then how would his crowd respond to the man at the door's reaction to not give his friend a loaf of bread despite the fact that he needs it, he needs to serve his friend? So how would the crowd at Jesus' time respond to these characters' actions?
There's kind of a mixed response because on the one hand, you're like, well, help a guy out. On the other hand, if you knew he was coming, maybe he should have had something.
Right, so he's failed in his task to be a hospitable guest by not having food for his friend. Is it implied at all that his friend shows up?
It doesn't specify. Maybe he knew he was coming, maybe he didn't.
Right. I think I'd be a wise follower. If I was an inquisitive person in the crowd, I would say, explain the situation differently. At the very least, though, I think they might be a bit taken aback at the man inside's lack of hospitality. All you have to do is open the door, stick your hand out a loaf of bread, and that's it. Okay. So with that in mind, is this parable supposed to be something allegorical, where each character represents something from the world and something from the kingdom? Or is there another way we can read this parable that perhaps is not allegorical?
One of the interesting perspectives I heard a few years ago was, for any parable, see if you can fit into every character. Are you perhaps even the friend who just showed up suddenly? Are you the friend who's on the hook? Are you the friend who's in bed?
Gotcha. So,
because it's got something to say to us kind of in each of those perspectives. And I don't know if you're going to get into the forgiveness of debts one. Okay.
Later on.
Okay, but there's kind of a little similar dynamic here. Well, I mean, if you're the one who's in bed, what should you do?
So that brings the focus of the parable on ourselves. If parables are supposed to direct us towards the character of God and towards the world of the kingdom, then how might this parable achieve that if it's meant for us to place ourselves into one of its characters? Can this parable in a way point towards God? So I want you to sit with that question. Can this parable point towards God? And I want to introduce to you an old rabbinic argument, which is light and heavy. You start with a light case, and then the heavier case is implied by the reaction from the lighter one. So in other words, if the solution applies in a simple case, how much greater in a more important case? And so here we have human reactions to a human problem. And we see that it's not favorable. Neither person is necessarily served. One serves himself, the one that refuses to open the door, and the other is kind of has failed in his service to others. We can make that argument. But if we take the argument from light to heavy, and we say that if you come to God's door and knock, is he sure to answer? If a human won't respond when you come and knock at night, does that imply that God won't respond even more? Does it imply that God will be more willing to open the door for you? So in this parable, let me say the question one more. In this parable, if this represents human responses to a problem, how then would God respond to a problem if we were to knock at his door in time of need?
I think the answer to that's implied in the following verses.
Yes. And which ones are those? Let's see. Like, which verses would you want to point out?
Well, immediately, you know, Jesus normally is like almost smug that nobody understands what he's talking about. But in this particular point, he actually explains this one to the crowd. And, you know, it's like, okay, if even you who are like evil, wicked men know how to give good things to your children, okay, God's got you covered.
Exactly. Yeah, I would say he might be a bit taken aback that people are kind of questioning, because nobody would respond in this way. And this time, somebody came and knocked on their door for bread. They would willingly open it and give it to them. Same thing as you were saying, Christopher. If he asks for an egg, will he not give him a scorpion? If you suppose one of you fathers asks his son for a fish, or you will not give him a snake instead of a fish, will he? In other words, Jesus is saying, this problem that I've set up is so unlikely, we could say it's near impossible. And so if it's unlikely that if you were to knock on your friend's door at night and you won't open it, then how much more unlikely is it that when you pray to God and ask for something, he will not respond? And so he's setting up sort of an inversion here of the situation, indirectly pointing towards God. And there's a assurance in that. And that if somebody will open the door for you, then that God will certainly open the door at any time that you come to him.
I wonder if Jesus is giving us this parable and that assurance, because he so desperately need it. At times it feels like God has closed the door on us when we go to prayer about particular heartbreaking things that just, so that the feeling, I wonder if that is like a kindness given in this parable, that of course God doesn't bar the door against us, you know, we feel, you know, it makes me think Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem about sometimes it feels like your prayers are meeting up brass heaven and just shattering, falling back to earth, nothing's getting through.
Which kind of leads into the, I'd say, necessity of persistence in prayer. And I want to kind of table that right now, but keep that in mind, the necessity for persistence. And we will certainly see that come up in our next paradigm, which we'll get into in a second. But the last thing for this one is that perhaps it is about persistence, but more so because of the inversion. At the very least, we can say that we have certainty, assurance that in our prayers God will hear them. Now, as far as the response and the time for that response, I think we can begin to touch on that in our next parable, which is the persistent widow, which is also called the parable of the unjust judge, which is in Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. And somebody would like to volunteer for that one. That'd be just
18, 1 through 8, okay. And he told them a parable to the effect that they ought always to pray and not lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected man. And there was a widow in that city who kept coming to him and saying, give me justice against my adversary. For a while he refused, but afterward he said to himself, though I neither fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will give her justice, so that she will not beat me down by her continual coming. And the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge says. And will not God give justice to his elect who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will give justice to them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?
Thank you. The same opening question. If we cut it off before Jesus' explanation on the back half of this, in the parable alone, what behavioral responses might stand out as profound, bewildering, or confusing in either the judge or the persistent widow?
I think the widow's pretty amazing because if I put myself there and imagine going before a corrupt official, he's got this reputation, I would think, why bother wasting my time?
Exactly, and widows were noticeable because of the garments that they wore in ancient times. And of course, God tells us to care for the widows, but the judge says he is not a man of God. So we can probably assume that he perhaps does not have as much care or concern for widows as, let's say, a righteous person, so to speak. So yeah, it takes great courage knowing that this person, this judge, more like is going to shut you down, but to keep coming back and coming back, especially with no support of a male in the household, which in the ancient world was pretty much essential. So yes, the widow's persistence is certainly admirable. Okay, any other behaviors or attitudes that you just find confusing or admirable?
I wonder if it would have been confusing to the original audience to hear a parable with an unjust judge, because Jesus so often tells parables in which it's pretty clear the father is represented by the master or the Lord or some authority figure, and then something happens and God's character is revealed through what that Lord or master or householder does. But here's an example where the judge is not a good character. And I wonder if that would be confusing to the original audience. What are we saying about God here? Obviously, Jesus goes on to correct that. But the initial impression might be, what are you saying about God? It's not just
and I had not seen this. I don't see a variant reading, but I've got a variant translation of, or that she may not eventually come and slap me in the face.
Yeah, yes.
Which there, that I would interpret that symbolically in like the public insult sense. So in that case, he's not even saying just like, oh, it's just bothering, I just can't stand her, but perhaps more of maybe he's saying, oh, well, I've got that reputation. If she keeps showing up over and over, everybody's going to start looking at me and say, maybe not thinking that she's actually going to slap him in the face, but maybe he's worried for his reputation, saying, maybe people are going to start asking questions about me and all this if she keeps coming. And so, okay, do that. So she'll go away and I can keep doing my deals over here and nobody will look into it too closely. But I mean, the same thing with the unjust judge. Like that was an interesting variant take on it. Maybe they're not just wearing him down, but maybe there's that kind of sense of my reputation is on the line, which kind of fits in with the later his explanation of it.
And so I wonder if the crowd might be thinking, what does this mean? God can be worn down by persistence. And not only persistence, can he be worn down by an attitude of, well, God didn't answer my prayers, so now I'm going to just desecrate his name throughout the city because my prayer was not answered. And so,
well, I mean, we find that in the Psalms, though. There's this whole God, I've done this. You're not paying any attention to me. Look at all this. So wouldn't be entirely alien to their tradition.
it wouldn't be. And then also in the Psalms, we find that later on, David experiences God's justice and his reward in God's time, so to speak. So
Well, the difference here, I think, is in the Psalms, the psalmists cry out and lament, but they appeal to the character of God.
Yeah.
They say, you are a God who made a covenant with us. You are a just judge. Don't let this wickedness continue.
Well,
here the widow doesn't appeal to his character, nor should she.
But he may be appealing to his reputation.
Yes.
And so then Jesus is saying, well, look, even this guy, he doesn't actually care. He only cares about his reputation, and he's going to take care of it. With God, God actually is righteous. And the same kind of how much more argument.
Yes, that's exactly what my next question was going to be. We've answered that is really, which is just we consider the rabbinic arguments of light and heavy. This is not suggesting God can be worn down with persistence. It's suggesting that maybe not that persistence isn't necessary, but that persistence has a different use, for lack of a better term. Persistence is not to wear down. Persistence is to maintain trust and to strengthen a relationship, which we will get to in our next paragraph. Okay. Oh, I kind of answered my own question, unfortunately, but maybe some more opinions. Then, why is persistence necessary? If this parable is saying that God is not worn down by persistence, matter of fact, Jesus, as Father Brian mentioned, even warns against repetitive, wordy prayers. But if this parable is not, this parable is saying God isn't worn down by persistence, but that persistence is something necessary, then why? Why must we be persistent in our prayer if it's not a means of wearing down God to take our side of the
Well, I mean, if you keep going down, he's saying, hey, no, God will grant justice quickly, which, we can all have our own doubts. But that's Jesus's answer is, to the question of persistence, that no, he's going to answer quickly.
And to tag along with that last phrase, I think is interesting. Will the Son of Man, when he comes, find faith on the earth? That persistence in prayer is a kind of test of faith. If every request is always answered, first time, immediately, just the way you wanted it, would you really be trusting God, or would you be trusting yourself? Like, oh, I've got an issue, I'll just shoot up a prayer and it's done. But needing to be persistent tests your faith in the one who can actually give.
I was thinking earlier, this kind of in the, the analogy with physical workouts, that you go to the gym, you put the plates on and you push and then you go home and then it's only over an extended period of time. And it's not even, the point of that is not that somebody needs those plates picked up off the floor. The point is the effect in you of over and over building up strength or character, or whatever it may be. Find faith in the earth.
So we could say persistence is a way, it's a maintenance of our faith. Either continue it in strength or in times of weakness to, I guess, build strength in those times through persistence. Because how often does God operate on a different clock than what we expect?
Too often.
Yeah, too often. But too often at the moments that he does operate on our clock, we're taken aback. So we almost don't expect God to operate whenever we feel like justice or an answer should come about. And when it does, oh, okay. But yeah, too often, God's clock is completely different in dimension and just time than our expectations. Okay. Any last thoughts on the persistence of prayer, why it's necessary? The last thing I want to focus on is this woman's persistence for justice. She wants vindication for some wrong that has come upon her. So we want justice immediately because injustice produces angst. And sometimes in prayer, crying out for justice might be cathartic. But then 20 to 30 minutes later, the angst returns whenever justice has not been revealed. So how does justice manifest when it comes from God compared to whenever we issue justice? How are those two outcomes different? Well, let's just go with the how quickly it happens. Whenever we issue justice, how quickly does that happen?
That's quick. And maybe if we're like very passionate about something, we want to get justice there and then.
So good one is always in traffic. Whenever somebody cuts you off, you want justice because they've done it. So what might we do? We might speed up and zoom past them, and then we'll meet them at the red light 2 minutes later and become even more frustrated. Vengeance, as we talked about, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, vengeance is quiet, immediate, and that maybe you prepare a plan for extracting vengeance, and then you gather your materials and go off and get revenge on whoever has wronged you. Okay. And then throughout Scripture, this your knowledge of it, how is it that God issues justice? Is it immediate and quick, and does it have the same effect as our issuing justice?
Sometimes, not always.
Okay. Also,
Well, I mean, you've always got stuff like Ananias and Sapphira, or I don't remember which of the sons it was who looked in the ark, that kind of thing. Sometimes it's rather prompt. Sometimes it takes ages and ages, literally.
So it's a process. It comes in gradual revelations, or the times that it is prompt. It is quite robust and salient, profound. But regardless, though, it's unpredictable in God's sense of justice. So maybe one prayer will issue forth whatever justice needs to be issued for 100 or 1,000 prayers. But the fact that God operates on a habit that is undefinable, and not necessarily trackable, our persistence alone is the only thing that we have to rely on. God's hearing our prayer and then acting on it whenever He, I guess, deems it right. And then finally, what does this parable reveal about God and our prayer life in Him? Well, one, I think we've made it clear that God is unlike the unjust judge. Jesus even says God is a just judge. But then what about our prayer life in Him from this parable? If we know that God will issue forth justice, and then of course, at the end of all things, He reconciles all things to Himself, all justice will be issued. What does it then say about our prayer life today? Knowing that God is just, but at the same time, these past 3 weeks, I've been dealing with the same problem, and my prayers do not seem to be doing what they are supposed to do. So how are we supposed to live our prayer life? Knowing that God is just and operates on His own time. We may have already answered that, but any final thoughts?
I just go back to the first verse. Jesus told this parable to teach them that they ought always to pray and not lose heart. That's really easy. After 3 weeks praying the same thing, maybe not seeing result for 3 months or 3 years.
3 weeks. Well, that's 3 weeks.
Right. After a long period of time, you can lose heart. And you begin to wonder, is God not hearing me? God, am I doing something wrong? Does God not care? Like, there could be all kinds of things going through your head. I think a parable like this is a good reminder that Jesus says, don't give up, keep praying. There's a point to the persistence. We do serve a just judge. And so all justice and righteousness will be made right in the end. The timing may not be the one that we want, but we can be confident in the character of God. And so for that reason, keep persistent and don't lose heart.
And because persistence can be wearisome, I think it's also a better incentive to let others know the troubles that you're experiencing or what you need prayer for, because maybe you just have no more energy. And if they're not having such a difficult time, there's plenty of energy within them to pray. So persistence also directs your focus to pray for somebody else other than just your wants and needs, because it is a taxing attitude, which we will come across in our next parable, praying for others or praying for yourself. And the Pharisee and the tax collector, which is in the same chapter in Luke, verses 9 through 14. So somebody would like to volunteer for those.
Okay. He also told the parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like all these other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, and even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to him, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted.
Good, thank you. I think us in the 21st century, it'll be quite clear which behaviors stand out as profoundly confusing, but let's place ourselves into the mindsets of the ancient world, if they heard this parable, matter of fact, the crowd is people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and meet others with contempt. So how would the crowd respond to both the Pharisees' prayer as well as the tax collectors?
Well, right up until about verse 14, they're probably thinking, okay, that's about right. This tax collector, he needs to be, he ought to be beating his breast and saying all this. Okay, good. He recognizes what he's, all right.
Exactly, yeah, tax collectors were quite reliable in the ancient world because they could tax you for anything, land tax, toll tax, travel tax, and then they would pocket whatever money they received outside of their contract. So yes, they would probably hear that and they would say, yes, that tax collector is a sinner. And then what would their attitude towards the Pharisee be, given that he says he's done all these things that he's done?
Yeah, he's done what he's supposed to do.
Right, so like so what's sitting today, we can immediately recognize the errors of the Pharisees' prayer, but they were seen, of course, as the righteous and the holy ones in the ancient world. So whenever they would hear the Pharisees' prayer, they might think, well, he's exactly right. Thank God he isn't like all of these others. And so he has every good right to pray what he was praying. Okay. And so what dichotomy then do we see in the Pharisee and the tax collector that we also see in the unforgiving servant and king, the two sons, the prodigal son and the one who remains at home, and then the privileged guests and the uninvited ones that we read about last week? How is there a similar dichotomy in all of those that's similar to the Pharisee and tax collector?
To coin a phrase, I might say trusting in our own righteousness.
Yep. How many times does the Pharisee reference himself in this prayer? I'll be out 5 times. He says I 5 times in this prayer. And look at the things that he says about himself. I'm not like other people, swindlers, unjust adulterers, tax collectors. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes that I get. So all of this is him thinking that, or the Pharisee believing that his works alone make him right with God. But is that true? That works alone, especially works where you congratulate yourself on. I think we know good and well that is not how, not it's the right way to get and get along with God. What is one thing the Pharisee is ignoring about God's command to us in this prayer? And if he doesn't ignore it, he speaks against it, so to speak.
And I think it's clear here that God's not against those actions, but God's against those attitudes. So whenever you're doing an action, it's not just good enough to not cheat or not steal or lie. It has to be you have to do those with the intent of honoring God. And clearly, the Pharisee was thinking more about himself than honoring God.
You're exactly right. So he's just obeying the first commandment, which is to love God. And in this prayer, it seems like he's loving himself. He's loving how he worships God. But then what's the second commandment that we have after love God?
Love your neighbor. And in particular on this, and he's specifically calling somebody out.
Exactly. Yeah, he's saying, thank you, I'm not like these others.
That not just like those people, but that dude. Oh, thank goodness, I felt like Lucas. I mean, oh, man, can you think of how terrible that would be?
Yeah. Imagine if this had played out, if this was a true event, and not a parable. he might say something like, I think I'm not like the unjust, or even like these tax collectors. Just to make sure you heard me.
Yeah.
So yes, not only is he misaligning the first commandment to love God, he is, in a sense, rejecting the second one, which is to love your neighbor. Doesn't pray for the swindlers and the unjust, but he just says, thank you that I'm not like them. Don't change them, because I need some sort of counter that I can weigh my own righteousness against. So make sure that they stay as they are, please. But just make sure I am not like them. Okay.
To your point too, Trey, about, kind of self-congratulatory, it's interesting the way Jesus describes the Pharisee. It says the Pharisee stood up and prayed thus with himself. It's almost not a prayer, it's a kind of self-congratulatory monologue with himself.
Yeah.
He's just kind of running through the list of merits that he has.
Well, yeah, prepositions are, notoriously hard. And so literally it's probably reasonable to say, he was just kind of saying these things privately. But literally it says he prayed these things to himself. And so there's that question of, well, does that just mean he's just like, or does that mean he's praying to himself? You're invited to think of how much more righteous you are than that Pharisee. And there's the trap.
That's good. Let's be charitable for a second and not assume that the Pharisee is deliberately being self-righteous and that he is not saliently aware that he is congratulating himself. Perhaps he truly thinks that he is acting in a way that is right and honoring to God. And so if we are that charitable, we grant him that, what could he be mistaken about concerning how we live an obedient life to God? Obviously not only self-righteousness, but how else can he be mistaken about what an obedient life looks like, given that this is his prayer? The tax collector's prayer might help with that question.
I think the tax collector probably thinks that like serving God is about action and about like doing certain things. So like even if he was, let's say, just like thinking that this is the right way to act and trying to do well, like he has misunderstood that the law is not about like, doing things, but it's also about being the type of person that is charitable, loves God and loves others.
Okay, yes, so not basing your obedience to God on works, on your own self-will to do X, Y, and Z, but to approach them with an attitude of charity, so to speak, charity towards others. But then also the tax collector, his focus is directed to God, but what does the tax collector say about himself, though? Literally, word for word, what does it say about himself?
Have mercy on me, a sinner.
Exactly, yes, he is a sinner. He is admitting that there's little or anything in him that God finds favorable. So one way to live an obedient life to God is in all of our acts and in all of the fasting, tithing, and spiritual disciplines that we have, to not lose sight of the fact that we are still sinners despite these acts. But with these acts, though, is how God alone is sort of cleansing us throughout this life. It's that process of restoration, and that process of righteousness that is being built in us. And it starts with that base attitude that, be merciful to me, the sinner.
I want to go back to what you pointed out earlier, that his focus is not on what he is doing, it's on what God is doing. So the Pharisee, well, I've checked this box, I checked this box, and the tax collector saying, you have mercy on me. Not because I've done anything, but because you do this.
Which, the last point is, this parable reminds me of the scene in Matthew, whenever Jesus tells Matthew to follow him, and afterwards he's sitting at the table with the tax collectors and sinners and Pharisees come up. Why is your master eating with these people? And Jesus overhears them and he says, those who are sick have need of a physician. Which the implication is for the Pharisee to admit, well, I'm sick too, Jesus, I need you, but the Pharisee is the last person to admit that they are sick. Which was supposed to be a question, I just answered on. That's okay. Yes, so I guess to kind of wrap up what we learned about prayers. 1 is persistence. 2, we have assurance that God hears us. 3, I suppose that persistence is necessary because God operates on different times than we do, and it's also a great way to maintain and uphold and strengthen our faith. It's a great way to establish community as well, where other people pray for you persistently. And then lastly, it's all coming from a place of humility, knowing that there's nothing that we can do to wear God down, persuade him to act in a certain way. All we can do is hope that our prayers align with his will, and that God will give us the discernment in our prayers to know what that will is, so that we know what to pray for. And oftentimes we stumble around in the dark trying to find that, but through the persistence of prayer, I think we can, over time, have a bit more clarity on how and what to pray, especially the attitude to pray with. Any last comments, qualms, anxieties over prayer in the kingdom, or any of these parables that we have touched on today? Hearing none, assuming none, let me close us out in prayer and Lord God, we thank you that we can come to you in humility. We can know that you are the life that fills us, and that you are the life that guides us, and that through our prayers we may know you. Through our prayers we may learn who you are, and more so help others in our persistence for them and their relief from despair, and our persistence for your restoration of this world. We know, Lord, that in all of our prayers, that you hear us and that you respond. We ask that you attune our hearts to your will and your movements, so that in our weariness we can maintain strength and confidence, and in our strength we can rejoice in what you have given us and what you provide for us. As we go throughout this week and through our lives, we ask that in our prayer lives that you become a clearer presence to us, and that we may know your will and delight in your ways, and that our lives may bring you glory and live to the honor of your kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, Trey.